Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Sword and the Medallion by Charles Lamb, narrated by Amy Mcfadden. Chapter 1. Unknown Place, Unknown Time. Her heart pounding out of her chest, Charlotte found herself standing beyond the edge of a clearing in the forest. She was hiding next to a tree, the heavy undergrowth concealing her as she watched the men searching for her pass her by. She knew she was in danger if they found her, but wasn't exactly sure why. Her mind was a jumbled mess as she tried to straighten out her thoughts. In her head, she had images and memories she had no connection to. There were words and conversations that were both foreign and familiar, as if she knew the meanings with no explanation as to how. She recalled a man, in a strange uniform, who was important to her. She closed her eyes tightly as she tried to gain control of herself. Opening her eyes once more, she looked down where she could see the medallion she had been holding in one hand as it now rested between her bare breasts. The long silver chain that suspended the metal disc was plain to see as it contrasted with her sweaty skin. She was not only startled to see she was naked from the waist up, but she was also now outside, and without any clothing beyond a wrap about her waist. The lean, toned form she saw was not the body she was familiar with. She was also confused to see she now had much darker skin and had small tattoos. For some reason, she knew they weren't permanent and would wash away if she were not careful.
¿Dónde está ella?
She heard one of the men shout from beyond the tree line.
No sé, sigue buscando,
came the response. Charlotte didn't understand a word they were saying, but felt sure they were speaking Spanish. Trying to determine where they had moved to so she could keep her distance, she slipped deeper into the woods. It was then that noise to her right caused her to panic and run. She saw the glint of steel as one of the men came into the open once more, his sword drawn.
Ahí está ella,
he shouted. Although she didn't understand the words, she understood the meaning as she saw him point his sword in her direction. She bolted from between the trees and ran in the opposite direction, her hand snatching the medallion once more to keep it from pounding against her chest. Running hard into the darkness, she struggled to control her panic, trying to flee the men shouting behind her as they took up the chase. On a dirt road just north of San Agustin, La Florida, 1741. Sergeant Juan Carlos Garcia sat astride his horse as he led the detachment north from Castillo de San Marcos in San Agustin. Their destination was Fort San Nicolas, a day's march north of their current location. The detachment, 8 men strong including himself, would garrison the fort guarding the upper Rio de San Juan, relieving the men currently occupying the position there. They would remain for 1 month before a relief force would come to replace them. Riding quietly at the head of the column, he ignored the grumbling of the men behind him as they worked their way along a dirt road that was barely wide enough for their wagon to pass. The dense plant life on both sides was backed by tall trees shading the trail from the morning sun. The wagon held all the supplies they would require for the month they were scheduled to be away. It creaked and rattled behind him as he led the procession north. The heavy woods, thick with undergrowth, ensured they would not wander off the beaten track. At 26 years of age, Juan had worked very hard to reach the position of authority he now occupied. Responsible for each of the men behind him, he took his job quite seriously. Unlike most of his men, he had never married and had little cause to complain about the extended absence from town. He could hear several of them mumbling about leaving their wives and families behind as they traveled north.
Sergeant, why have you never married? You have no children?
His corporal asked, as if reading his mind. Like Juan, the man was astride a horse, slightly behind him and to one side. Behind Corporal Armando Mendez was the supply wagon, pulled by a third single horse and led by a soldier on foot. Bringing up the rear were the final 5 men, all shouldering muskets as they trod along in the early morning heat. Juan knew well that he would need to provide more frequent breaks as the heat of the day came upon them, and the sun high in the sky would beat down from directly above. It was for that reason he began their journey just before sunup.
"Oh, the good Lord has granted me many children. I see 7 of them right here," he replied in good humor. "You know what I mean. A wife to care for you, and a home of your own," the corporal responded. "God has not seen fit for me to have such a life," he replied simply.
As he was speaking, he shifted the sword at his belt, looking for a more comfortable position where its hilt wouldn't dig into his side.
"Signor, that is a magnificent blade," the corporal commented as he noted the motion.
This was the first time the two men had been assigned together. They were not familiar with each other. In the past, Juan had mostly been assigned to officers as the senior non-commissioned officer, or NCO. For this duty, he had been placed in charge of the small detachment, too few to require an officer in attendance. The corporal was his second in command.
"Is it really Toledo steel? May I see it?" "Yes, a gift from my father before I sailed west from Spain. It was his hope that such a fine sword would keep me safe,"
he added absently as he removed the blade from its scabbard for the man to inspect. Juan was accustomed to the request, as Toledo steel was both highly prized and rare among the lower ranks. Corporal Mendez had a sword at his side as well, but it was a common-issue blade drawn from the armory. He passed the weapon carefully over to the man and watched as he examined the blade more closely. While considered an act of respect and an honor to allow such an action, he always chafed until the sword was returned to its scabbard.
"It is magnificent,"
the man said as he cautiously passed it back, careful not to let it fall as they exchanged the weapon on horseback.
"Thank you."
Sheathing the blade, he recalled the day his father had presented the weapon to him. Juan had been both surprised and angry at the gesture. Not a wealthy man, the blade had likely cost his father a year's wages. But Juan could not refuse the gift without deeply injuring his father's pride. As his only son, Juan understood the meaning and accepted the sword with gratitude. From that day, he had trained hard with the blade to ensure the gift was not squandered.
"Let us hope its blessings extend to us all,"
the man added, referring to the dangers that lay north of their location. Phillips Highway, north of St. Augustine, Florida, present day. Charlotte Foxworth Garrison sat quietly, looking out the passenger window of her husband Robert's truck as they traveled south toward St. Augustine. They had left home early that morning to make a 9 a.m. meeting in town, a meeting she had great hopes for.
"Who are we meeting with again?"
Robert asked his wife, who had taken over managing many aspects of their business. "The St. Augustine Historical Society has agreed to meet with us for the purposes of certifying you as an inspector. With their blessing, you are not only approved for any historical work there, but can also consult on other people's projects on their behalf." Charlotte considered the interview a coup, as very few architects or contractors in the area had that seal of approval. She hadn't revealed to Robert that she had invited the principals of the society to Foxworth House while he had been away on business. His frequent absences for work touched something deep inside that scared her. She regaled the invited group with stories of the home's history and demonstrations of the work that had been done there. Extremely proud of her new husband, she had included photographs of his other completed projects from around the country, as well as the awards he had received for his work over the years. His status as a war veteran and the humanitarian work he had done in the war zone had also impressed them greatly. The gathering had been such a success that they had been invited to apply that very day. Truth be told, this trip to town was Charlotte's first major venture away from their house on the river since that night at the end of their pier. They had taken a few small excursions to town for fun, but those had been shorter and more of a distraction. She had not traveled much beyond the confines of their house and property since before their wedding. They had wed at the house, a small gathering that had included her Aunt Victoria, and spent their honeymoon enjoying its peaceful tranquility. Robert had arranged for everything they required to treat the time as a vacation. Catered food all day, and the occasional live music at night was better than any resort she had experienced. She had not needed to lift a finger the entire time. Their whirlwind engagement and marriage had swept her up into a sea of emotions, her love for the man sitting next to her burning bright. She could tell he felt the same, his constant doting leaving her with feelings of security and love. Although they had tried to share their innermost feelings in the weeks they had spent together since that awful day on the pier, she struggled with what she nevertheless withheld from him. Still psychologically recovering from her near-death experience, she declined the offers to travel with Robert. She was content to enjoy the safety and security of their home alone and await his return. There, she would try and sort out the thoughts and emotions so turbulently mixed in her head. It wasn't just memories she was struggling with. There were images and emotions mixed in that made no sense to her at all. She was now tracking her days with reference to the dominant personality of the moment. Sometimes, like when the society came to visit, she was Charlotte, a more reserved and serious version of herself. Other days, particularly around Robert, she was Charlie, playful, flamboyant, and light-hearted, totally devoted to the man she married. Then there were the mixed days, where the two tried to come together as one. More often than not, it was a battle, and not a union. Finally, there were times, less frequent than the others, that she could not explain. She would enter a room and get flashes of pictures in her head. Some images would spark anger or excitement, while others would evoke a warm, serene feeling. At those times, she felt neither Charlie nor Charlotte, but almost disembodied, like she was apart from human form. It was those days, mixed with that inner turmoil, that she was struggling to control. Since the night on the pier, when Robert had revived her limp, lifeless form after dragging her from the stormy river, she had been, well, more. As a whole, more confident in herself, more decisive in her thinking, and more in love with Robert than any man she had ever known. But also more confused. It was strange to her to think that she didn't need him, or anyone for that matter, but more than anything, she just wanted him in her life. This was held up in stark contrast to the woman who had arrived here just a short time ago. Charlie had always been a loner and constantly on the move, so she had never developed emotional attachments to anyone. Never overly confident, she floated from place to place, just getting by. She had always seemed to find someone to pay the bills, using them as a safety net of sorts, but nothing more. Now, for the first time in her life, she felt the confidence to be on her own, without the need of anyone. She just knew that she was more than capable of handling anything that came her way. But that was paired with the feelings of desire she had for her new husband, someone she wanted to share her life with, not surrender herself to. Well, that wasn't entirely true either. Charlie was all in when it came to her devotion to Robert. Her feelings were untainted by her past, never before experiencing the emotions that Robert inspired in her. Charlotte, on the other hand, was in love with the man of the present, but still pined for true love, one lost to the past. She had never quite recovered from Jefferson's death, even now. Also, her Charlotte identity was still struggling with returning from the dead. While the house and grounds were familiar to the Charlotte of old, the people and things were both an oddity and marvel. Planes in the sky and cars on the road out in front of the house would occasionally catch her off guard until her thoughts were made whole with Charlie. She eventually realized that her time as Charlotte, bound to the house, came to her more as disembodied rushes of images, rather than memories. She knew part of her had been a ghost, bound to her house, the one constant in her life, and defending it as a mother would her only child. Living in that house once more, lovingly restored by a man who appreciated it as no one but Jefferson ever had, she found comfort and stability. In Robert, she looked to a new future that she had thought impossible. It was that, more than anything else, that had swayed Charlotte of old to accept Robert as a potential substitute life partner. And he had taken her in as a partner in life, not only addressing her as his equal, but freely surrendering parts of his life to her. She was well aware that the business they now shared together had been his everything. Like a child that he had nurtured alone, she was now, like him, its guardian and mentor. And then there was the house. While in her head, she knew it was something he had brought back from near ruin, a home for them to share. Her heart told a different story. Deep inside, she felt a profound sense of pride and ownership she could not explain. There was a sense of satisfaction at its endurance through the decades, buried deep down, that she could only attribute to her family legacy.
"Turn here?"
Robert asked, as they neared the historic district where Castillo de San Marcos stood guarding the entrance to the Matanzas River and the St. Augustine Inlet. "Yes, that's it," she replied, the question bringing her focus back to the present. Today she was Charlotte again, serious and focused, and she intended to do everything in her power to see her husband was accepted into the society. Charlie was in complete support of the plan to keep Robert close to home. He was one of the few things the two personalities could agree on. It was only a few more turns before they found themselves parked in the lot for the oldest house museum complex, the Society's offices. Climbing out of the truck, they met at its rear. "Now don't be nervous, they will love you," she said as she adjusted his tie.
"Charlotte, I'm fine. You need to relax,"
he said with a smile before kissing her lovingly. "I just want them to see what I see. The best restoration architect in the country, maybe the world," she replied after they turned toward the Society's offices.
"You are very biased,"
he answered as he led her away from the truck, hand in hand. "Besides, do you know how much work there is to do here? With this certification, we can stay busy for years and never even have to leave our hometown," she informed him as they headed to the door.
"If I didn't know better, I would swear you were trying to find a way to keep me here all the time,"
he replied with a laugh, giving her hand a squeeze before reaching for the door. She felt the slightest pang of guilt, as that was exactly her plan. Entering the offices, they were immediately greeted by one of the society members Charlotte had met at her gathering.
"Mrs. Garrison, so nice to see you again,"
the man announced as he met the couple in the hallway. "Charlotte, please, and this is my husband, Robert," she said quickly, as she could see the glint of suspicion in her husband's eyes.
"Call me James. Please, follow me,"
the man added after shaking Robert's hand. Leading her husband by the hand, she quickly fell in behind James before he had a chance to question her.
"If you would go ahead inside, Robert, I will find a place for Charlotte to wait for you. Unfortunately, she cannot attend. The interviews are private, and we can't make exceptions."
The man opened a door and motioned for Robert to enter. "Good luck, honey," Charlotte offered as she mirrored James's motion.
"Please, follow me,"
James said to her after closing the door behind her husband. Charlotte followed as James led her into a museum display area.
"Feel free to explore the grounds while you wait."
He indicated the room and the door leading to the grounds beyond. "Thank you," she replied as she watched the man retreat. Wandering about the room, Charlotte examined the various items on display, being careful not to touch anything out of respect. While most of what she saw was out in the open and not behind display cases, she doubted very much that it was an open invitation to touch. She suspected most guests entered this area under a guide's supervision. "Mrs. Garrison?" she heard from behind. "I thought it was you. It's so nice to see you again," Charlotte heard as she turned to find another of the people she had met at the party. She couldn't remember the woman's name, but recalled she had something to do with artifact restoration. "Thank you. Please, call me Charlotte." "I understand your husband is here for the grilling," the woman said in good humor. "Yes, I hope he's up to it," Charlotte replied in the same humor. "I am sure he is. Would you like to come back and see behind the scenes while you wait?" she asked with some excitement. "I would love that." Following the woman, as she led her from the public area of the museum, Charlotte suddenly remembered that her name was Janet and that she specialized in Florida Spanish history, both first and second colonial periods. Janet led her out of one building and across an open grassy area until they entered a second structure. All the buildings were of the same mixed Spanish-English architecture, as was a large part of the historic district. Passing through a wooden door that certainly looked old, they crossed a small entry. "This is my humble domain," Janet announced with a flourish as they entered a back room that was mostly shelving from floor to ceiling, row after row. Along one wall was a workbench with various tools and equipment. Scanning the shelving opposite the bench, she could see them packed with so many items that it left Charlotte with the impression that Janet could never complete her work in several lifetimes. There was a mixture of large and small boxes, as well as many loose items of every shape and size. "So much," Charlotte commented as she pointed to the rows. "Yes, some of that comes from local digs, others are donations, and all are things that need to be identified, dated, and cataloged. Others, like the one I'm working on now, are to be authenticated before they can go on display," she added as she led Charlotte to her workbench. On the bench before her, Charlotte could see several items laid out on a cloth, cleaning solution bottles and swabs nearby. There were coins, earrings, a finger ring, and a small drinking cup laid out. Central to the collection was a silver pendant, its heavy silver chain still looped through an eye-ring at the top. "What's that?" Charlotte asked, again having the good manners not to touch the items as they lay on the table. "This was donated to the museum recently by the estate of a Jacksonville family. Most of this was acquired over the generations, as they lived in the area. This medallion was said to be the very first piece the family acquired," Janet explained as she picked up the item to show her. "The family claims it was discovered by an ancestor who had worked on the strawberry plantation for John Sammis, a mill worker, I think he was. It was passed down from generation to generation, inspiring the family to continue collecting other Spanish artifacts. We think this item originally belonged to a Spanish soldier, likely lost as they fought with the French or British in that area," she added as she passed the medallion to Charlotte for inspection. The metal had no sooner touched her fingers than Charlotte began to swoon, her head spinning as she struggled to stay on her feet. She felt her fingers grasp the medallion firmly, its edges digging into her fingers, just before she blacked out completely. Robert was sitting calmly as the last of the reviewers offered up his questions for him to answer. Each of the 5 people sitting before him was an expert in some area related to historic restorations. Some were in construction like himself, while others were more historians or in art preservation. He had just completed the answer when James burst into the room. "Mr. Garrison, I need you to come with me quickly," he announced with some urgency. Not waiting to ask why, Robert bolted from his seat as the man led him through the building, then outside and into another. Inside once more, they came to a back room. A quick scan of the area told Robert that this was either a storage area or a workroom, but it was the prone form of his wife on the floor that grabbed his full attention. "What happened?" he asked as he dropped to his knees next to the woman who had Charlotte's head on her lap. "I was showing her some of our work here when she fainted." "Charlotte?" he asked as she began to stir. He heard a slight groan escape her lips before her eyes began to slowly open. Robert could see the panic in her eyes as they went wide, and she clutched at herself as if trying to cover her upper body. On the one hand, he could see she was holding something, a silver chain trailing from her clenched fist. "Where am I?" she asked weakly as she glanced about the room. He could see her visibly calm as she regained her senses. "We're at the museum, honey," he replied as he accepted a bottle of water from someone standing nearby. "I was in the woods, running from someone," she said in confusion. He could see her looking down at her body, as if checking to see everything was still there. "Here, drink this." He offered her some water, confused at the statement. He watched her as she sipped several times before speaking again. "Oh, my. That's much better. I'm so sorry," she said as she tried to get up.
"Let's wait for a second," Robert replied as he halted her rise.
After a pause to check her over, he assisted her to her feet, watching her closely as he did so. Once she was upright, he saw her hesitantly extend one hand, a silver medallion attached to the chain exposed as she opened her fist. The woman accepted the offering without a word and placed it back on the table nearby.
"You must forgive us. Charlotte almost drowned recently, and we shouldn't have stressed her today with this trip,"
Robert said aloud, as much for his wife's benefit as the audience around them. With that, he gently escorted her out of the room.
"I will let the review board know what happened," James called after them.
Without a word in reply, the two exited the museum and returned to the truck, where Robert helped his wife climb inside.
"Are you okay?"
he asked before closing the door. Charlotte nodded.
"Do you want to see the doctor?"
"No, let's just go home," was her only reply. Chapter 2. South of the Great River, deep in the woods, 1741. Wandering slowly among the trees in the late afternoon, Kelotera was in the forest gathering fruits and berries. As a young unmarried female of the tribe, it was her responsibility to roam the woods near her village, looking for the wild-growing plant life that provided what she sought. Having performed this task for many seasons since her return to the village, she had several locations she checked on a regular basis. She was grateful to be in the shadows of the tall trees as the heat of the day was upon her. Wearing only her traditional wrap, covering just her hips, front to back, she could feel the slight breeze as it cooled the perspiration on her bare skin. Somewhere between 17 and 19 seasons old, her skin was mostly unadorned, as she had done little to earn the tribal markings so many of the others in her village bore with pride. The few markings she did carry would wash away should the rain come. Without a mother or father, as they had been taken by illness when she was still quite young, she was left in the care of the village, a common state these days. Once a member of a vast people, ranging far and wide, the coming of the European invaders had brought war, sickness, and death, to the point that their numbers were almost gone. In other villages, the elders had embraced the foreigners' ways, converting to their god and forsaking the old ways of the Timucua. That brought them the benefits of metal tools and weapons, but in return, their men were taken for work and warfare, while the women and children suffered. It was for that reason that her village had chosen to remain separate from the foreigners, hidden away from their more popular travel routes. They had seen the French, British, and now the Spanish come and go around them, while they strove to keep the old ways, rejecting all else. That wasn't completely true, though, as Kelotera had been able to learn English from her British captors. Taken as a little girl not long after her parents' death, she was used as a servant for the foreigners, tending to their unpleasant household needs. Too young to be considered interesting to the men, she was left to wash and clean up after them, always a knife's edge away from death if she was considered useless. It was for that reason she had always worked her hardest. Growing up as the property to these foreigners, she had never enjoyed true freedom until now. Even her name had been decided by her captors. Unable to communicate with them when she was taken, they had called her Rabbit as she scurried from duty to duty. Eventually, even the other Timucua had taken to calling her Kelotera, which meant Pretty Rabbit in her native tongue. She had escaped her servitude several seasons ago, when most of the soldiers had left to attack the Spanish. She slipped away with several of the older women held with her, doing as they told her. Besides the things they had taken with them, she now had the ability to speak their language. It had proven helpful on more than one occasion, as they had traded with the strangers who secreted goods in and out of the area. She had also learned a few words in Spanish, but French had proven elusive to her. It was as she was thinking of the dangers that the Spanish now represented to her people that the sound of movement drew her attention away from her work. Always cautious, she crept to the edge of the woods near the path where she could hear a rattling and clanking that told her strangers were approaching. As she peered from the darkened shadows, hidden away from anyone out in the bright sunlight, she could see the line of Spanish soldiers as they traveled past. 2 were riding horses.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?